The alien mother staggered through the dense jungle, her limbs trembling under the weight of her fragile child. Her once glorious armor, now cracked and scorched, every breath burned in her chest. But she refused to stop. The air was thick, heavy with moisture, and the distant howls of predators echoed through the night, her vision blurred. But she clutched her child tighter, feeling the weak rise and fall of its small chest. She had promised to protect her baby, no matter what, even when her own people had cast her out, left her broken and bleeding on this savage world. Branches scraped against her skin as she pushed forward, her senses alert to every sound. Her people believed humans were monsters, violent beings who destroyed everything they touched, yet she knew the truth. The real monsters were the ones who had abandoned her for refusing to hand over her child, a child they deemed too weak to survive. The Empire had no place for weakness, and mercy was a luxury no one could afford. A twig snapped behind her, heart pounding. She spun around, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Something was following them, something big. The ground trembled beneath her feet as low growls rumbled through the air. She knew she was being hunted. Her muscles ached from exhaustion. But there was no time to stop. She darted through the underbrush, each step harder than the last. But her child whimpered softly, a faint sound that pierced through the noise of the jungle. The mother's throat tightened. If they found her baby, they would tear it apart, just as they had tried to tear her apart. The growls grew louder, closer. Her legs burned. But she forced herself to move faster. Up ahead, she spotted a break in the thick trees, a narrow ravine with jagged cliffs. If she could reach it, she might have a chance to lose whatever hunted her. But her body was failing her. Every step felt heavier, her strength slipping away with each breath. A deep snarl cut through the night. Her blood ran cold as a massive beast emerged from the shadows. Its black eyes gleamed with hunger, its jaws dripping with venom. It was twice her size, its fangs sharp enough to tear through armor. She knew she couldn't outrun it, not while carrying her child. She turned and pressed her back against a tree, cradling the child against her chest, her body tensed, ready to fight to the death if she had to. The beast lunged toward her, and in a final desperate move, she raised her arm to shield her child. She braced for the impact, knowing there was no escape. A thunderous crack split the air, a violent explosion of sound that made the ground tremble. The beast collapsed mid-leap, its head snapping back as a massive hole burned through its skull. The alien mother froze, her breath caught in her throat. From the smoke stepped a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in battered armor, a long rifle still aimed at the fallen beast. It was a human. The stories told of their ruthlessness, their cold efficiency. But this one had saved her. The human lowered his weapon, his face hidden behind a helmet. As he stared at her in silence, the mother held her child tighter, at every instinct screaming to run. But something in his posture, something in the way he hadn't killed her on sight, made her pause. The human reached into a pouch and tossed something toward her, a nutrient pack. It landed softly at her feet. Then, without a word, he turned and began walking away, leaving her with a choice: follow him or die alone. The alien mother hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest as the human disappeared into the shadows. The nutrient pack lay at her feet, its strange scent unfamiliar, but promising. She knew the risks of trusting an outsider, especially a human, yet the gnawing hunger in her stomach and the fragile warmth of her child in her arms left her little choice. With trembling fingers, she tore the pack open. The contents were dense and bitter, but nourishing. She took small bites, forcing herself to eat, knowing her survival depended on it. Her child stirred weakly against her chest, its breathing shallow and uneven. The mother's throat tightened. She had come so far, had fought so hard. She could not lose her child, not now, not after everything she had endured. Glancing once more toward the direction the human had gone, she made her decision. The jungle behind her was alive with unseen dangers, and her strength would not last much longer. Clutching her child closer, she rose on unsteady legs and followed the human's trail. The air grew colder as she walked. Shadows stretched long beneath the towering trees. Every rustling leaf and distant growl set her nerves on edge, her senses strained for any sign of the human. He moved quickly and quietly, leaving behind only faint traces of his path, broken twigs, a footprint in the soft earth. The metallic tang of his weapon still lingered in the air. She pressed on, her body aching with every step, the weight of her child pulling at her limbs. But she would not stop, not while there was still hope. A sudden sound cut through the silence, the sharp click of a mechanical device. The mother froze, her muscles tensed as she scanned the darkness ahead. Glowing red lights flickered through the trees. She recognized the technology. In an instant, automated sentry drones, her people's hunters, no doubt sent to finish what the warlord had started. Panic surged through her veins. She knew what these machines were capable of. They would find her, track her, and there would be no mercy. Before she could react, a rough hand gripped her arm, dragging her down into the underbrush. She struggled for an instant until she saw the human crouched beside her, his visor glinting in the dim light. With one finger to his helmet, he signaled her to stay silent. She clutched her child tightly, her breath shallow as the sentry drones drifted closer, their sensors sweeping the area for any trace of life. The human moved swiftly and silently, pulling a small device from his belt. With a flick of his wrist, he sent a pulse through the air, and the drone sputtered and fell silent, crashing lifelessly to the ground. The mother stared in disbelief as the human rose to his feet. Without a word, he turned and continued moving deeper into the forest. She hesitated for only a moment before following. Every instinct told her to be wary, but he had saved her again, and she could not afford to be alone any longer. The jungle thinned as they climbed a rocky ridge at the top. The human paused, scanning the horizon before leading her to a narrow crevice, barely visible beneath the tangled roots of an ancient tree. He slipped inside, and after a moment's hesitation, she followed. The air inside was warm and dry, the walls reinforced with human technology. She realized it was a shelter hidden from the outside world. As she lowered herself to the ground, cradling her child, the exhaustion she had held at bay crashed over her. In waves, the human knelt nearby, pulling out supplies without speaking. But the gesture was clear. For the first time since her exile, she was not entirely alone. The alien mother sat in the dim shelter, her body aching from exhaustion. Her child stirred weakly against her chest, its breath shallow but steady. The human moved with quiet efficiency, removing his helmet to reveal a scarred face with cold, calculating eyes. He knelt by a storage crate, pulling out unfamiliar tools and containers. His expression gave nothing away, but his every action seemed deliberate, focused. She tensed as he approached, but he only extended a small metal canister toward her, a gesture of offering. Hunger gnawed at her, but instinct kept her wary. She had been taught that humans were brutal conquerors who destroyed anything they could not control. Yet this one had saved her twice, and now offered her more with careful hands. She accepted the canister. Its contents were warm and rich, far more nourishing than the emergency rations her people had left her. She fed herself, slowly forcing her trembling hands to steady, then turned her attention to her child. The human watched in silence, his sharp gaze never leaving her every movement. He seemed to study her not with malice, but with curiosity, as if he were trying to understand her. She knew he must be wondering why she had been left behind, why an alien mother and child were wandering the wilderness alone. But she had no words to explain, not in his language, not in her weakened state, and even if she could, she was not sure she would trust him with the truth. A sudden shiver passed through her as the memories flooded back, the betrayal, the fear, the warlord's cold voice echoing in her mind, demanding her child as a sacrifice to secure his power. She had refused, knowing the cost: exile, death, abandonment. Her people saw weakness in compassion, but she saw life in the small, fragile being she now held close. She would never let anyone take her child from her, not while she still had breath in her body. The human stood and moved to a wall where he adjusted a flickering holographic display. Lines of data scrolled past in symbols she could not decipher, but the images were clear: schematics, maps, tactical information. She recognized the unmistakable silhouette of an alien warship hovering above the atmosphere. Her heart clenched in fear. They were still hunting her. The human must have known it too, because his movements grew sharper, more urgent. Without speaking, he gestured for her to stay put, then disappeared through a hidden passage, leaving her alone with her thoughts for a brief moment. The shelter felt too quiet, too still. The faint hum of the machinery, the distant rumble of thunder outside. It was safer here, but safety was an illusion. She knew that better than anyone. She pulled her child closer, brushing a hand over its delicate crest. The child stirred, its eyes fluttering open briefly before exhaustion pulled it back into sleep. The human returned moments later carrying a heavy case, which he set on the floor with a dull thud. When he opened it, the cold gleam of weapons and explosives reflected in the faint light. Her stomach tightened. Humans were as dangerous as the stories claimed. But in that danger lay a strange kind of protection. She did not fully understand why he had chosen to help her, but she knew one thing with certainty: whatever hunted her now would soon face something far more deadly. The mother met his gaze as he stood over her, his face hard and unyielding, but behind the sharpness she saw something else, something she had never seen in her own kind, resolve not for conquest, but for survival, and perhaps, just perhaps, a glimmer of something even stronger. The alien mother watched the human carefully as he worked his hands, moving with practiced precision as he assembled weapons and checked equipment. His face remained hard and unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity in his every motion. Something about him felt dangerous, but not to her, not yet. He was a creature of violence, but there was no cruelty in his actions, only purpose, and for reasons she could not fully understand, that gave her a fragile sense of safety. Her child stirred weakly in her arms, its breath shallow but steady. The human noticed the movement, and after a moment of hesitation he knelt beside her. Without a word he held out a small device, smooth and metallic, its faint blue light pulsing rhythmically. She flinched instinctively, but he made no aggressive moves. Instead, he placed the device on the ground between them and gestured toward the child. His meaning was clear: it was medicine, or something close to it. Trusting him felt like a mistake, but she had no other choice. If her child died, nothing else mattered. With careful hands, she lifted the device, pressing it gently against the child's fragile form. A soft hum filled the air as the light pulsed. Brighter warmth spread through her fingers as the device activated, scanning, healing, repairing. She held her breath as she felt her child's breathing grow stronger, steadier, and for the first time in days hope stirred in her chest. The human watched without speaking, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of something deeper, something that hinted he understood more than he let on. He had no reason to help her, and yet he did. She wanted to ask why, but their languages were too different, too broken for true understanding. Instead, she lowered her head in a gesture of gratitude, the closest thing to trust she could offer. Satisfied that the child was stabilizing, the human returned to his work, preparing for something she did not yet understand. She studied him more closely now, taking in the strange details of his armor, worn and scarred, but meticulously maintained. There were markings etched into the metal, symbols of a past she could not read, but the weight they carried was clear. This was a man who had fought many battles and survived against impossible odds. A sudden tremor shook the ground beneath them, faint but unmistakable. The human froze, his posture sharpening into something cold and lethal. He tapped a panel on the wall, and a holographic display flickered to life, showing an aerial view of the jungle outside. She recognized the shape of the approaching craft, sleek, angular, and unmistakably alien. Her heart clenched in fear. They had found her. The human's jaw tightened as he scanned the incoming threat. But there was no panic in his movements, only cold, efficient calculation. He reached for his rifle, slinging it over his shoulder, before tossing a smaller weapon toward her. She caught it, instinctively recognizing it as a plasma pistol, compact but deadly. She had no idea why he trusted her with a weapon. There was no time to question it now. He moved toward the entrance of the shelter, but then he paused, turning back to face her, his voice low and rough. When he spoke, the words were unfamiliar, but the meaning was clear: stay here, protect the child. He would face whatever came for them alone. But as the sound of engines grew louder and the scent of ozone filled the air, the mother realized something else with absolute certainty. She would not let him fight alone. The alien mother clutched the plasma pistol, her heart pounding as the human disappeared through the narrow entrance, his footsteps silent, and sure, the distant hum of approaching engines grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the hidden shelter. Her muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at her to take her child and run. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere safe. The human had given her a weapon, trusted her with the means to fight, and that trust anchored her fear, turning it into something sharper, stronger. Her child shifted in her arms, breathing steadier now the human's device had stabilized the fragile systems within, but the child was still weak, too weak to survive another encounter with the warlord's hunters. She'd brushed her fingers gently over the child's crest, a silent promise that no one would take her baby from her. Not while she still had breath. She could not fail, she would not fail, no matter what came through those doors. Outside, the air grew heavier, the engines cutting off with a sudden mechanical hiss, followed by the sharp clank of armored boots striking the earth. She recognized the sound, the warlord's elite enforcers, bred and trained for one purpose: to hunt and kill deserters, traitors, and anyone who dared defy his rule. Fear twisted in her stomach. But beneath the fear burned something else, rage, cold and pure. These creatures had taken everything from her, her home, her people. And now they wanted her child. She would die before she let that happen. A sudden crack echoed through the air, the unmistakable sound of the human's rifle splitting the silence. There was no warning, no hesitation, just deadly precision. Another shot followed, then another, each one striking with mechanical efficiency. Through the dim light of the shelter, she could feel the battle unfolding outside. The human was not fighting to survive, he was fighting to win. But even he could not hold them off forever. More footsteps, more voices, speaking in the harsh, clipped tones of her people. The warlord's hunters were relentless, and they would not stop until they found what they were looking for. Her child, her mind raced through the possibilities, every escape route, every advantage. But the truth was unavoidable. If the human fell, she and her child would not survive. A sharp metallic clang rang out from above, something heavy crashing against the outer perimeter. The enforcers had found the shelter entrance, and they were cutting their way inside. Panic surged in her chest, but she forced it down, locking her body into stillness. The human had given her a weapon, but he had also given her something far more valuable: time to prepare, time to act, and she would not waste it. She shifted her child into the protective cradle of her arms and rose to her feet, her muscles coiled with tension as she moved toward the entrance. Shadows danced across the walls as the cutting torch burned through the outer door. She positioned herself at the edge of the opening, plasma pistol held steady in her grip, her heart hammered in her ears, but her focus sharpened like a blade. The first enforcer stepped through the breach, tall and armored, his eyes scanning the dark. Before he even had time to react, she fired. The plasma bolt struck his chest with a searing burst, sending him crashing to the ground. The second followed, and she fired again, cold and precise. She was no helpless exile, no broken mother. She was a survivor, and anyone who came for her child would learn the cost of their mistake. The alien mother stood over the fallen enforcers, the plasma pistol humming softly in her grip. Her breath came fast and sharp, but her hands were steady. The scent of scorched metal and burned flesh filled the air. But there was no time to think, no time to stop. More were coming. She could hear their footsteps outside, heavy and unyielding. The warlord would not send only a handful of soldiers. He wanted her broken and her child taken, and he would not stop until both were his. From the distance, the sharp crack of the human's rifles still echoed through the night, each shot deliberate and lethal, but even his precision could only hold them back for so long. She knew the enemy's tactics. They would flank, surround, overwhelm. He was just one man, no matter how skilled, and she would not let him die alone, not after everything he had done for her. A flicker of movement caught her eye, another enforcer sliding through the breach, his weapon raised. She fired before he could react. The plasma bolt seared through his armor, and he collapsed in a heap. Without hesitation, she moved forwards, stepping over the bodies, the weight of her child still warm against her chest. Her heart pounded, but fear had no place here, only action, only survival. She reached the entrance and slipped outside. The jungle was darker than before, the thick canopy blocking out the moonlight, but her senses were sharper now, more focused. She moved swiftly and silently, the human's training echoing in her mind. Every step measured, every breath controlled. Ahead, she caught a glimpse of him moving through the underbrush, his rifle steady as he fired another shot, dropping an enforcer with cold efficiency. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a shared purpose. She was no longer just a burden, no longer just a mother, clinging to survival. She was a fighter, and she would stand with him until the end. Together, they would protect the child, no matter what it took. A sudden explosion rocked the ground, sending a shockwave through the trees. The warlord's forces were bringing in heavy artillery, trying to flush them out. The human barely flinched, adjusting his position as he reloaded his rifle. But she knew they could not hold this position much longer. The enemy was too many, and they were only two. If they stayed, they would die. The human gestured toward the ridge ahead, a narrow path leading deeper into the mountains. If they could reach it, they could lose the enemy in the rough terrain. But the path was exposed, and the warlord's forces were closing in fast. She nodded her understanding, and without a word they moved together, weaving through the shadows like predators on the hunt. Blaster fire tore through the air behind them, but neither slowed the human, led the way, his movements fluid and precise, while she stayed close, keeping her child shielded against her chest. Her body ached from the strain, but she would not stop, not while there was still breath in her lungs. As they climbed the ridge, she heard a sound that froze her blood, the deep mechanical thrum of a war drone sweeping through the jungle, its sensors searching for life. Once it locked on, there would be no escape. The human must have heard it too, because he stopped, his eyes narrowing as he pulled a small device from his belt. Without hesitation, he handed it to her, his voice low and rough. One word, clear: run. But she did not run, not yet, not without him. The alien mother's heart pounded as she clutched the device. The human had given her, its edges cold against her fingers. His meaning was clear. The device was a failsafe, a last resort to mask their heat signatures and give her and the child a chance to escape. But leaving him behind was not an option, not after everything he had done for them, not while he stood between them and certain death. The war drone's mechanical hum grew louder, slicing through the night. As it swept closer, its sensors flaring in the darkness, she knew what would happen if it locked on. A single strike would reduce everything in its path to ash, and once it found them, it would not stop until there was nothing left of her and her child. The human crouched low, his rifle steady, as he scanned the tree line, his face cold and unyielding. But beneath that she saw something else, resolved not to survive, but to ensure they did. She took a breath, forcing the fear down. As she shifted the child's weight against her chest, the device could hide them, but only for a while. And if the drone found him first, there would be no one left to protect them. She would not let that happen, not while she had the strength to fight. Her decision was made. In an instant she moved before her mind could catch up, pressing the device against her child's fragile form and activating the field. A faint shimmer wrapped around them, bending the heat signature away from their bodies, making them invisible to the drone's scanners. The human's head snapped toward her in surprise, but she was already moving toward him, her plasma pistol warm in her hand. She would not run, she would fight beside him, no matter the cost. She reached his side and dropped to her knees, her back against his. As she scanned the jungle for movement, the drone hovered above the treetops, its scanners flickering as it searched for signs of life. He spoke low and sharp, a single word that needed no translation. Why? She met his gaze, her voice steady and quiet. Because you saved us, and I will not leave you to die. He held her gaze for a heartbeat, something shifting behind his cold exterior. But there was no time for questions, no time for hesitation. The drone shifted, lowering toward the clearing. The warlord's forces would be close behind, and if they stayed here much longer, they would all be dead. The human moved first, fast and precise, pulling a compact launcher from his belt and locking a missile into place. He aimed for the drone, his fingers steady on the trigger. The missile streaked through the air, striking the drone with a violent explosion. Metal shards rained down as the drone crumpled in a heap of burning wreckage. But the blast gave away their position, and the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Without a word, he grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet, and together they ran, weaving through the dense jungle as blaster fire tore through the air around them. Her lungs burned, and her legs trembled, but she would not stop. The human led them toward the ridge, his focus unshakable. But she knew the truth, even he could not fight them all. If they did not escape, soon they would be overwhelmed. Ahead, the ridge narrowed to a rocky outcrop, sheer cliffs falling away on either side. It was a dead end, no way forward, no way back. The human turned, scanning the horizon as the enemy closed in, his jaw clenched tight, as if already preparing for the final stand. But the alien mother refused to accept defeat. She would not let her child die. She would not let the human die. and in the distance beyond the cliffs, she saw their only chance. The alien mother's breath came fast and shallow as she stood at the edge of the ridge, the jagged cliffs, falling away into darkness below. Behind her, the sound of armored footsteps grew louder. The warlord's enforcers, closing in their weapons, humming with lethal energy. The human stood beside her, his rifle steady, his face a mask of cold focus. But she could see the tension in his jaw, the grim acceptance of what was coming. If they stayed here, they would die, and the child would be lost. But beyond the cliffs, she saw it, a faint shimmer barely visible against the night sky, a hidden pass, a narrow path cutting through the rock face. If they could reach it, they could escape. The human followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the distance. The drop was steep, and the ground below was unforgiving. One wrong move would mean death, but staying meant something far worse. Without hesitation, she shifted the child against her chest, securing the fragile form with the last of her strength. She met the human's gaze, her meaning clear. There was no other way. They had to jump. His mouth tightened into a thin line, but he gave a short nod, accepting the risk without question. The footsteps behind them grew louder. Blast of fire hissed through the air, striking the rocks near their feet. There was no more time. The human moved first, slinging his rifle across his back as he leaped from the edge, his body twisting in midair, before landing in a controlled roll on the rocky ledge below. Pain flared through her limbs as she followed, clutching her child tightly against her chest. The wind whipped past her face as the ground rushed toward her. She landed hard, her knees buckling, but she held the child safe, unbroken. A sharp whistle cut through the air, and she turned to see the human reaching for her, his hand outstretched. No words were spoken, none were needed. She grasped his arm, and together they ran along the narrow ledge, the jagged rocks scraping against their skin. As they moved, the path was treacherous, barely wide enough for two, but they pressed forward, every step drawing them closer to freedom. Above them, the enforcers reached the edge, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. She knew they would not hesitate to follow. The warlord's will was absolute, and failure was not an option. One of them fired a plasma bolt, streaking through the air. The human pushed her aside, the blast searing past her shoulder and slamming into the cliff face. The rocks groaned under the impact, sending a cascade of debris tumbling into the void below. The path trembled beneath their feet, but they kept moving faster now, their breaths harsh and ragged as the cliffside loomed ahead. The hidden pass was closer now, within reach. If they could make it, they would be safe. But the enforcers would not stop, not until they were dead or captured, and the child taken. The human skidded to a halt as they reached the mouth of the pass, his body blocking the entrance as he turned to face their pursuers. She knew what he meant to do. Before he spoke, he would hold the line, give her and the child a chance to escape. But she would not leave him, not now, not after everything they had endured together. Without a word, she stepped beside him, raising her plasma pistol. The human's lips curled into a faint smile, a flicker of something fierce and unyielding. If they were going to die, they would die together, and they would make the warlord's forces pay for every step they took. The alien mother stood beside the human, her plasma pistol humming softly in her grip. As the sound of approaching enforcers echoed through the narrow pass, her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. She had come too far, fought too hard to give up now. Her child stirred weakly against her chest, the warmth of fragile life grounding her in the chaos. She would protect this child, no matter the cost, even if it meant standing against the warlord's most ruthless killers. The human shifted his stance, his rifle raised and ready, his face cold and unreadable. But beneath the surface burned something fierce and unyielding. He had no reason to fight for her, no obligation to protect a mother and child who meant nothing to his kind. And yet he stood beside her now, as if their survival mattered, as if their lives were worth defending, and she knew with absolute certainty he would not abandon them. The first enforcer appeared at the edge of the ridge, his armor gleaming in the moonlight. The human moved before she could react. His rifle cracked loud and sharp. The shot punched through the enforcer's helmet, sending him tumbling lifeless into the void. But more followed, their weapons blazing red-hot plasma bolts streaking through the air. The mother ducked behind a jagged rock, shielding her child as the blasts shattered the ground around them. The human remained calm, methodical, each shot precise and lethal, But they were outnumbered, and the enforcers were relentless. Another burst of plasma struck the cliff face, sending a shower of molten rock cascading down. She fired back cold and efficient, her pulse steady. As she dropped another enforcer with a clean shot to the chest, the child let out a soft whimper, and she tightened her hold, whispering a silent promise that nothing would harm them. The air grew thick with heat and smoke, but they did not falter together. They moved as one, a seamless unit, striking with deadly precision. But the warlord's forces were too many, and the narrow pass would not hold for long. She could feel the ground tremble beneath their feet, the cliff face weakening under the relentless assault. If they stayed, they would be buried alive. But if they ran, the enforcers would hunt them down, and there would be no mercy. The human's voice cut through the noise, low and rough, a single word go. He was telling her to leave, to take the child and escape, while he held the line. But she did not move. She would not leave him, not after everything he had done for them. She met his gaze, fierce and unyielding, and shook her head. Whatever came next, they would face it together. A sudden explosion ripped through the pass, the force of it sending her sprawling across the rocky ground, her vision blurred as dust filled the air. But when she looked up, she saw him still standing, his armor scorched, but unbroken, his rifle still raised, and his face set in grim determination. And behind him, beyond the pass, lay open sky, freedom within reach. Without a word, he grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet, and together they ran the ground crumbling behind them. As the cliff gave way, the enforcers shouting in fury as the path collapsed, cutting off their pursuit. The human led her through the last stretch of the pass until the jagged rocks gave way to open air and the vast horizon beyond. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, they were free, battered and exhausted, but alive. She turned to face him, the weight of everything that had happened heavy between them. And in that moment, she realized the truth. He was no longer just a stranger, no longer just a protector. He was something more, a lifeline, a promise that no matter how cruel the universe could be, there were still those willing to stand and fight. And as the rising sun painted the sky in gold and crimson, she knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, because some bonds forged in battle could never be broken.